Today we're going to analyse our second Emily Dickinson poem, I Had Been Hungry All the Years. And this recording is certainly not an exhaustive or complete analysis of the poem. Rather, it's just the introductory ideas that you will later use to flesh out on your own. So if you pick up something today that I have not said, I don't want you to discount it. Rather, it's something that you're bringing to the poem through your own analysis, which is really excellent. So the poem I Had Been Hungry All the Years is actually, for Emily Dickinson, quite a linear, straightforward poem. It doesn't have that level of confusion that some of the others have. And once you get your head around this notion of hunger being a metaphor, it's actually something that it's quite stepped through for her. We know that Dickinson was somebody that really oscillated between extremes, and that's a direct quote from some critics of Dickinson who said that she was someone that operated between the two extremes, and this poem is no exception. We see her very much having a cry for inclusion, a desire to be part of society, but fundamentally at a much deeper level there's something that's preventing her from doing that. The poem in itself is quite a paradox. It's quite a paradoxical poem because there are those competing forces that come into play with the persona where it is difficult to want and desire that sense of inclusion and belonging, but there is something that is preventing that from happening successfully. So as I said earlier, hunger, we need to consider it as an extended metaphor. So while the poem is on a literal level about the persona who is hungry and who is witnessing food and thinking about consuming food, we also need to think about the much wider metaphorical ideas behind that. So that unfulfilled, insatiable desire, that hunger that the persona is feeling to connect with somebody else, to connect with society. And it doesn't happen successfully. And the reasons behind that could be very varied. It could be the persona choosing not to connect. It could be the persona feeling they could not connect. That's a decision that you will come to through your own analysis of the poem. So we see from the very first line of the poem, and I'm sorry, I've used a time marker, which I know I told you all not to do yesterday, but I'm going to do it today. She says, I had been hungry all the years. So we have a very strong modal here again. I had been hungry all the years. And the notion that something had happened, we can see that there's an act of suppression there as well. The following line, my noon had come to dine. Now, dine has some interesting connotations to it because she's not simply come to eat or to satisfy hunger. Dine implies a social interaction, so sitting down to dine and to share a meal together. So there's a sharing of a feast here. And despite that feast, we can see that there's a real sense of apprehension. I trembling drew the table near. So what Dickinson is doing in this line is she's using the syntax, which is what we call sentence structure, and she's actually inverting it. So I trembling drew the table near is not how we would, as we learnt yesterday, traditionally construct a logical, straightforward, simple sentence. So we're seeing that sense of apprehension in her. The final line of this stanza, and touched the curious wine, touched has the connotation that she's not actually consuming it, she's not actually drinking the wine, she's just going to touch it. Whereas curious also implies a sense of uncertainty. She's curious about the wine, she's mystified about the wine. So there's this deliberate sense that this social interaction of sitting down to dine, to share a meal together, is something that is completely foreign to the persona. Now, it's not, as I said before, literally her sitting down for a straightforward meal. It has a much wider implication than simply that. So the second stanza creates a very domestic image, and Dickinson begins by saying, it was on this tables I had seen, when turning hungry lone, I looked in windows. So we're having this sense of her outside a domestic environment, looking into a window and seeing something on a table. So the word seen implies that it's not actually something she's participated in or been part of. The persona has only witnessed it from afar. She's seen it when she's turning, she's seen it when she's hungry, she's seen it when she's lone. Different versions of this poem, as translated by her friends, sometimes replace lone for home, which would greatly change the meaning in that line. The windows we see a couple of times in this poem, and it is symbolic of a barrier for the persona. It serves as something that separates the two worlds from each other. When she refers to wealth here, we could argue that wealth is metonymy. So metonymy is a figure of speech where one thing stands for another. So when she is discussing wealth, when she is discussing this ample, glorious, amazing spread, she's not actually discussing the spread itself, she's discussing the connection she desires with society. You could refer to it as metonymy, you could refer to it as an extended metaphor. It's one of those techniques that's quite broad and would overlap in many respects. The final line, I could not hope to own, is again a very strong modal. So we've had two strong modals now. I had been hungry, I could not hope, and they're very strong, very negative modals. So we're getting this sense that here she is able to witness what the rest of society participates in, and due to the windows and due to the fact that she's very anxious about it, she's very worried about it, she's curious about it, there is that sense that she's not fully participating in it. The third stanza shows the personal reaction from the persona to this situation. It's the first time they acknowledge the differences between what they're witnessing and their own circumstances. I did not know is another example of a very high modal, and we see the contrast here between the ample bread and the crumb. So the bread in this case is metaphorical for those social interactions. The persona does not know that sort of ample interaction, that widespread societal interactions. Rather, they're exposed to the crumbs, the absolute minimum. And the idea of the crumb actually comes up in a couple of the other poems that we will study. The persona continues this by saying the birds and I had often shared. So unlike the crumbs that the birds and I had often shared, we see the first time she is establishing a connection with somebody else. And in this case, it is nature. And where they had shared these crumbs was in nature's dining room, so in the natural world. So there's often a confusion between the fact that Dickinson did not leave her home towards her later years of life or her bedroom, but she quite frequently talks about nature. And it's establishing that dichotomy between the natural world and society that really is at the heart of a lot of the poems that we study for belonging. The dining room connotation here it's almost comedic in a sense, because nature's dining room versus the tables with the ample spread is quite a contrasting image for the responder. As the poem continues, we see the persona again reveal very personal reflections on this. The plenty is what she has started to term this notion of an entire ample spread. And this assertion, the plenty hurt me, is another example of Dickinson's very simple but very effective language. It was so new, myself felt ill and old. So these short monosyllabic words here reinforce the very great sense of disconcertion she's having. Myself felt ill and old is another example of what we saw earlier with the inverted syntax. And Dickinson really was a master of making that have a great effectiveness in her poems. This comparison down here, as berry of a mountain bush transplanted to the road, is a simile, because you're saying the berry of a mountain bush, it's as if it has been moved to the road. It's completely unnatural. So the road is symbolic for society, for progress, for those interactions, whereas the persona sees herself as a berry on a mountain bush. And it's as odd to see that berry growing out of the road as it is to see her interacting in a social setting that we have. The final stanza of the poem is a little bit like This Is My Letter to the World, in that you could interpret this tone in a lot of different ways. You could interpret it as a very triumphant, successful tone, so the persona has realised that this is not what she desires and has rejected it. You could interpret it as quite a sad or reflective tone. So she realised that this is what she desires and is never going to be able to achieve that. So that's completely up to you. There's no right or wrong way. It's just how you discuss it. We can see here that she's beginning again with a strong statement about how she's feeling. Nor was I hungry. So we've seen that she's basically graduated down through the poem in a very linear sense to get to this point. I very much her final resolution. So I found that hunger was. Many people interpret this as Dickinson's attempt to define what is hunger, to define what is society. And she defines it as a way of persons outside windows, the entering takes away. There's many different ways that you could look at this. There's certainly not a definitive answer because it is a very ambiguous final statement. But what we can establish is that she does have a certainty that there is a clear distinction between the world that is ample and wealthy, and the world that she exists in. And there is a clear barrier that is stopping her from accessing both of those. So you can see that the windows are what's serving as the barrier, but what the windows stood for, what they were symbolic for, is a different matter altogether. And on the poem in general, we can see that Dickinson has a repetition of the word hungry and hunger. So it's in the first, second, and twice in the fifth stanza. So you could argue that there's evidence that this is at the forefront of the persona's mind, this hunger for human connection, and what is much more socially acceptable and socially relatable to position that hunger as a literal physical hunger, where someone is coming to the dinner table, they are sitting in front of it, and they are in awe because their whole life they have not had access to this kind of wealth and ample spread, so they are in awe at what is before them. Persona's discomfort at seeing the plenty, the fact that it hurt her, the fact that it caused her to feel ill and odd, we could possibly interpret that as the competing forces between the persona's attraction to social interaction and the persona's reticence or reluctance to engage with that social interaction. Have certainly argued that the poem is Dickinson's rejection of the abundance and the artificiality of society in favour of the simplicity of her own company, the simplicity of nature, and as we have seen from the rubric, these kind of competitive forces are running right throughout it. So I'm just going to flick to a side of the rubric. These are two sentences taken from the rubric, and they do have a lot of pertinence to Emily Dickinson and this poem in particular. We can see that she, by she I mean the persona, is considering aspects of belonging in terms of this unique experience of sitting down to eat an ample meal and the associations of what that means. This idea of a relationship. There is no reference to anybody else sharing the meal with her. There's no reference to anyone preparing the meal or waiting to eat with her. So even the perception of a relationship is of itself quite removed. And that extends to an idea of acceptance. Who is she being accepted by? Who is she being rejected by? They are not even given a name. It's this great unknown society. And her level of understanding, you could argue, does she reach it at the end here? When it says, is she at a very angry tone here, a triumphant tone? Is she at a reflective tone? What does she come to understand? Text may also represent choices not to belong or barriers which prevent belonging. So again, this is up to your interpretation. Does she choose not to belong? Does she realize the reality of her situation? And does she reject society? Or does she realize the reality of her situation in that there is a barrier to her connecting to society? So you can see here that here is another oppositional choice in itself, a choice to belong and a barrier to belong. So I hope this has led us to a point of greater understanding ourselves, and I have not died of embarrassment listening to my voice for almost 14 minutes. Let's do some work.